Hi, welcome to Fast Forward Live here on all kinds of places. And with me tonight, our guests are Nancy Kress and Jack Skillingstead. Guys, welcome to Fast Forward.
Thank
We're
you.
glad to be here.
Yeah. So you guys all doing all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, if it would ever stop raining. We're here in Seattle, and it just rains and rains and rains and rains.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The good thing about that is, though, that we're both getting a lot of writing done because it's just too depressing to go outside.
Or wherever
Well,
I
that's what I
go,
want-
it's too depressing.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's that. So what I'd like to talk some about while we're here is about your writing process and how you guys work and what you do, because you're a two-writer household. So how does that work? Do you have like separate places that you sit, or you like sitting across from each other at a table, or what goes on? No.
Oh, no.
No, separate studies, and that's where we work. And also entirely separate schedules, which helps.
Ah,
Jack is a night person, and I'm a morning person. Lately, as I get older, too early. But I by the time he staggers downstairs at 10:30 or in the morning demanding coffee, I've done my writing for the day. So we just
ah,
overlap.
Right. Yeah, I usually get really started probably around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I have my coffee, walk the dog, etc. You know, there was a writer, Robert Parker, the detective writer, and I read an interview with him once where he and his wife had gotten divorced, but they owned this fabulous house, so they decided to just keep living in the house. It was so big. He lived in the lowest part, and she lived on top. And then they were still friends, so they'd meet in the middle and have meals and stuff. But it was a very interesting situation. Dan and I are not
you,
divorced.
you didn't you use something like that in one of your stories?
I'm almost positive. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a story where he was there and he was in the same place as his wife and
Oh
his
yeah, no,
ex-wife.
that was my detective story. It was Army
Yeah,
Bear, and he falls in
yeah,
love with the little memory module of the murdered mother of the serial killer. Yeah,
yeah.
That way.
That sounded familiar. I said, wait a minute.
Our
You
procedures,
writers, you use everything.
we draw
I'm
everything
sorry,
from
yes.
life.
Our procedures aren't completely separate, though, in that we critique each other's manuscripts. After there's
Yeah, I
a
was wondering.
second draft, not a first draft, but a second draft, we will critique each other's manuscripts. At the second draft,
Mhm.
it's still malleable enough that you can make changes, but it's not like a first draft where somebody is going to say, "Did you know that the whole middle part doesn't connect to the last part?" I mean,
Right.
that kind of thing has been dealt with already. One hopes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one hopes. And so you do kind of like beta read for each other.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
That must be helpful.
I've read everything Nancy's published and hasn't published. When we first started being acquainted, I made it my business to read all of her published work, and then later on, she showed me some of her unpublished short stories.
Ooh,
I'm well versed in the Nancy Kress oeuvre.
the oeuvre.
No. When he says unpublished short stories, he means the ones that from my trunk, where I was trying to teach myself to write. We're talking back in the late 70s here, or mid 70s. And they're really bad, Mike. I mean, they're really bad. Occasionally, when I teach, I take out one of them. If I have a very skitterish class of beginners, I take out one of my very old stories and give it to them. And we practice critiquing on that because there's no way they're going to hurt my feelings with this thing. And they start out tentative and then they really enjoy ripping into it. But you can learn a lot about what not to do from some of my early stories.
Oh, that's useful.
It is.
Useful. Now, what you guys weren't some of the people that I've talked to that was like from when they were kids, it was like, I'm going to tell stories. I'm going to be a writer. You guys
Yeah.
both kind of got into it later.
He was early. I was later.
Yeah.
Jack?
What got you started, Jack?
Um, Well, I was always a reader. I mean, the story I always tell, which is about 76% true, is when I was a kid and the old Star Trek series came on, I became so obsessed and enamored of it that I paid close attention to the end credits to see who had written the scripts. I wanted to be in that world back then. And I knew I couldn't actually be in the world because it didn't exist. So I thought, well, the next best thing would be to be a writer. So I started watching the end credits of who produced these scripts. And it was from there that I started linking up with real science fiction writers, because Harlan and Robert Bloch and Theodore Sturgeon and I think George Clayton did a script. There were a bunch of real science fiction people involved in it.
Yeah.
And then I would go out and look for books or magazines or whatever I could find with those particular writers in them. That sort of got the ball rolling with me. And that was,
Cool.
a long time ago. I mean, I was like
Yeah.
11.
Yeah. And Nancy, you started when you had kids, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I started very late. I never intended to be a writer. In the world that I grew up in, a very conservative Italian-American family, this was not a possibility. When I was 12, my mother sat me down and said, "Do you want to be a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary?" And that was the limits of what I assumed was possible for women in the 1950s. So it never occurred to me to be a writer. I kind of thought when I was very young that all writing that had been done was done, and that all writers were dead. It was a finite resource like oil, and we were going to run out of it, but there wasn't any more being produced. We didn't live near a bookstore. We lived way out in the country, and I didn't have access to a lot of books, only in the school library. So it didn't occur to me to be a writer. And I started when my children were very small, and I was living out in the country with my then husband. No other women my age at home on the road. They all had gone back to work, and I was going nuts. And I started writing. I was pregnant with the second child, and the first one was running around as a toddler. And I started writing to have something to do that didn't involve Sesame Street, and involved words with more than one syllable, and had some intellectual content to it. It was a long time before I took it seriously, but it kind of grew on me, like mold.
Yes, we have a question. If you look from Species XX, saying, "Why aren't you two sitting together on the same screen?"
We don't like each other.
Good question, because we have a difference of opinion on lighting. You can see he's sitting there.
Yes.
Well, we do Zoom meetings all the time with people, especially our good friends Daryl Gregory and Kathy, and we're always sitting where Nancy's sitting, and it's kind of squished. So I'm usually kind of sitting back like this, and Nancy's sitting forward, and it looks as though her head is twice as big as mine. And brain capacity wise, it probably is, but nevertheless, this seemed like a better.
And the lighting fits you nicely there, Jack.
Thank you.
It kind of works for you.
I think it looks sort of demonic. There's a bright light coming from behind him over one shoulder.
Well, having read some of his short stories, yeah.
I want to throw in too. It's not just the Star Trek thing. I read a lot as a kid, although not a lot of adult stuff. It was like Danny Dunn series of, Danny Dunn and the Time Machine, all this. But I vividly remember my first actual science fiction novel, which was Galactic Derelict, and by what's her name? I can't remember now. It was part of a series of books. Anyway, those words really, I looked up derelict because I'd never seen that word before. I was about, 9 years old. And I just relished it. I relished the sound of it, the way the way it just sounded coming past your lips. So, and I can still remember the first line, which was, "It was hot." And I was right into the story right away. And it made an impression on me. And it was shortly after that the Star Trek thing came on, and then I was looking for those writers at the drugstore and the bookmobile and all that.
Jack is more sensitive to individual words than I am. He's really much better at a sentence level, at looking at the images and the words and the way things sound.
Now, do you think that kind of thing affects the way you write or what you write?
I think so.
Yeah, I'm a linear thinker. I tend to think about this is going to lead to this, and this is going to lead to this, and this is going to lead to this, both in plotting and in more specifically in the way characters act. But from what Jack has told me, he's much more an associative thinker. An image will come or an idea will come, and then things kind of shoot off it like rays, and he'll follow some of them and see where he wants to go with it. But the images often precede. Am I right on this, Jack? Often precede.
Yeah, the associative thing, I have to say, works better with short stories than it does with novels. My path through novel writing has been rockier because I'm mostly an intuitive writer who would like to be more of a rational writer. So, and that works fine for a short story. If you're writing 3 or 4 or 5,000 words, you can just, as I used to do, would write the story over and over and over again, excising whatever words or sentences didn't work and kind of discovering what it was actually about that way through images. But with novels, you can't really do that. You need as John Gardner, the great literary writer, used to say, sooner or later, you have to figure out what you're doing. And with novels, sooner is better than later.
Jack and I are in agreement in this. The major thing I've learned over the course of my career, and that I try to transmit to my students when I'm teaching, is that it's about structure and character, and they're connected. It's certainly not about prose, or there wouldn't be so many novels published with really terrible prose. And sometimes it isn't even about character, because there are certainly a lot of novels out there, bestsellers, very popular books, where the characters seem pretty stock. But structure, which, like Jack, I didn't really pay much attention to because I was writing short stories. There's a reason all of my awards are for short fiction. Well, all but 2. And not for novels, because short fiction, you can do what he just said. You can get started and then kind of let it flow and see where you're going to end up. But I've learned painfully and long the hard way that for a novel, structure has to be paramount. And you have to think about structure as it relates to character, but also just about structure on its own, much more than I used to. And it sounds odd to say that at this point in my career, I'm just learning that, because there were writers certainly that have that sense from the beginning. But for me, this has been a late revelation. Not that structure is important, but how important it is. How much it almost trumps everything else. Readers, if they want to know what happens, if you've raised the dramatic questions that they want answered, they will keep reading. Whereas if your prose is absolutely incandescent and your characters interestingly complex, a certain number of them will stop. Anyway, not all of them. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Virginia Woolf. But a lot of them will.
Woolf's an interesting case, though,
point.
because what's the book that was made into that great movie? We just read it. We just watched it.
It was Mrs. Dalloway, and then
Mrs. Dalloway, right?
So
I found that book accessible and fascinating and really just great. But then I tried to read To the Lighthouse, and I couldn't get past like page 7. It really was a roadblock. So I've asked myself, why is that? What were the interesting story elements of Mrs. Dalloway that kept me engaged? And it's not just the prose. I used to read a lot of Vladimir Nabokov when I was doing my heavy lifting reading. And a lot of the time, I didn't know what he was talking about in some of his more complex works, but it didn't matter because his prose line was so beautiful. The language was so great, and he was so witty. And Virginia Woolf's, she's kind of like that. I mean, she's got a pretty terrific prose line, but it wasn't enough to carry me through To the Lighthouse. It just wasn't. But it served her really well on Mrs. Dalloway.
My favorite of all time science fiction writer is Ursula Le Guin because she did it all, especially The Left Hand of Darkness, and especially my favorite, The Dispossessed. The structure is there, the character is there, the ideas are there, which often distinguishes science fiction from other genres. Other genres will have character and structure, and you'll be very interested. But ideas about the future, the way society is structured, that was a Victorian concern, but it's not a concern of the modern novel very much, which tends to be small and focused on character. But Le Guin could do it all. And I partly taught myself to write by reading Le Guin over and over. Not that I think I could ever do that well, but just to learn how she managed to say so much in just a few paragraphs. And also her use of exposition. She gets away with a phenomenal amount of exposition, but she knows where to place it, and she knows how to present it in a clear and interesting way so that you don't start feeling that you're reading just an essay. In The Dispossessed, for instance, Shevik is right there in the middle of all her exposition, observing it as we do.
Yeah, it's amazing thinking back to her stuff that there is a lot of exposition, but when you're reading it, you don't realize it. You don't realize you're reading this exposition. It's just the story.
Not unless you're me, trying to analyze very carefully.
Yeah.
How did you do this? How did you get away with so much exposition?
Well, man, I remember when you read Those Who Leave Omelas. Is that the title?
Yeah.
You read that at the Rainforest Writers Retreat we always go to, except we're not.
No, I read one of her other ones, not that one.
No, wasn't it that one? Which one did you read?
I can't remember the title, but it was much earlier. It took place in a Viking sort of setting.
A Viking setting?
Yeah.
Well, I'm completely misremembering it then. Were there a lot of big red beards and stuff?
There were not. She doesn't do those kind of simple tropes.
Okay.
No.
We'll forget that then.
What was I going to say?
Sounds like it was an interesting story, though, Jack, about her reading.
Yeah.
The Ones That Walk Away
The
from
reason I was reading it is we go to this rainforest retreat every year, except we're not going this year, that Patrick Swenson organizes on the Connaught Peninsula, which is 5 days of holing, basically, and in cabins and rooms and writing, except people come out to listen to the occasional lecture, and they also come out to socialize at meals. So it's sort of a homegrown SF Yaddo or something like that, except we added the odd lecture in. And the reason I was reading the Le Guin out is I was talking that year about endings, and I was talking about how at the climax of a story, and as you move towards the ending, all the forces you set in motion have to come together and affect each other. And so I read about 2/3 of a Le Guin story, and I wish I could remember which one. That's terrible, but I can't.
You're sure it's not Those Who Leave Alma?
I'm sure it's not that, honey. And then I asked everybody to say, okay, what forces are in play here? And how do you think they're going to come together? And what possibilities do they have for coming together? So that's why I was reading it aloud.
What's the one about the clones where the one guy dies and the other one is bereft?
Oh,
that was great.
My favorite one too.
He smells the shirt.
It was published in Playboy.
Yeah.
There's a famous story about that in 1969. She published it. Hugh Hefner at that point was doing his own fiction editing. He hadn't yet acquired a fiction editor, and he bought the story from her. And I'm quoting her now. He asked me very gently if I would mind having it published under UK Le Guin, not Ursula Le Guin, because he said we have male readers and female writers make them nervous. And she went on to say, and I'm also quoting, I agreed because at that time I didn't see that it was important. And of course, later on, we all got to see that it was important. Yeah. But the title will come to me. It's about the 12 clone. Of course, sometimes things just slip out of my mind, and then I have to wait for them to slip back in again on their own sweet time.
Tell me about it. Tell me about it.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, because getting ready for these interviews, I've been kind of rereading a lot of your guys' stuff, and novels, and stories, and things, and looking at themes and things. Do you ever think about the theme of a story while you're writing it, or do you go back later on and go, oh, that's what it was about?
For short stories, I don't think about it. It emerges from what happens. And I may rewrite later on after I realize what I'm doing. For novels, I pretty much know where it is, what it is that I want to say. Because a theme is really no more than a worldview. And even the simplest piece of crappy fiction has a worldview. I mean, the worst written simplistic romance has got the worldview, which most romances do, that love conquers all. There's always an implied worldview in anything that's written.
Jack, do you think about that in your?
I do it somewhat now with novel writing, but I found that if I get too conscious about what I'm doing, it undercuts what I'm doing. Maybe like in later stages, like in the third or fourth draft of a book, I think it's more appropriate there, at least for me. But as I'm thinking about, like I'm writing a book now, and I'm thinking about these things, and I don't want to think about them too much, because I think what counts in a novel is the story.
Uh-huh.
And if you're distracted by like, well, wait, what am I trying to say in this? And I'm writing this scene, and wait a minute, that doesn't support what I'm quote trying to say. It might screw you up. So I try not to do that.
A very helpful fan, Steve Cordell, has given us the name of the Le Guin story, 9 Lives.
9 Lives. Right?
Yes, and that's what it was.
That was good.
Thank you, Steve.
Steve's a good guy. He's a friend of ours. When we were doing the show in the studio, he's one of our producers.
Ah, well, thank you.
Good guy, good man. Thanks, Steve. You were talking about, with the difference between doing the short stories and the novels. And Jack, you took one of your short stories and turned it into a novel. And it went through a lot of changes doing that.
Yeah.
And it took you a long time.
Again, that's the conscious effort to manipulate a narrative as opposed to the intuitive flow of it. So that you're probably talking about Life on the Preservation. And I wrote that book a few times with a preconceived conscious outline and structure, and it just never worked. And I finally just threw all that out and started following some images around. That book it's a very intuitive book, and it works pretty well, I think, because I wasn't undermined by my own conscious second guessing about what I was doing. And it was a finalist for the Philip Dick Award too. However, that kind of thing is hard to pull off. It's hard and it's slippery. Like I can do it in short stories. I'll rewrite a short story a bunch of times and find my way through it. And my first 2 novels were kind of like that, Harbinger and Life on the Preservation. But it's pretty hit and miss. I mean, I've written a lot of novels that haven't been published. Like when I was younger, I'd write novel after novel after novel. And there were, I think, 3 novels in between Harbinger and Life on the Preservation. So I didn't want to do that anymore. And I decided my next book would be a thriller, science fiction thriller. And to that end, I read a lot of thrillers in all different genres, and really thought hard about how I was going to put this thing together. And that was a different experience. But it helped the writing of the novel itself go a little bit smoother.
Cool. And something else I'm curious about here is, because you both have written all different lengths of fiction. Do you have a length that you prefer, that you enjoy writing the most?
Oh, I do, for sure. I very much prefer the novella. It's for me, it's a perfect length for science fiction. It's long enough that you can develop an alternate world or an alternate view of the world and a full set of characters, but it's short enough that you really only need one plot line that can barrel all the way through. And in fact, my novellas have been among the most successful in my fiction. And although I swore when I started writing I would never commit trilogy, I actually have 3 times, and each one started with a novella. And then I felt the story wasn't finished. But the novella for me just has enormous energy, and yet it's contained enough that you can't usually read it at one setting unless you're really absorbed. But it still is short enough that one plot will do, and you can really get into the ideas in that one plot in a way that you can't with a short story.
Jack, do you have a length you prefer?
I have a length that I'm better at, which is usually 3,000 to 5,000 words. But I don't think you're locked into anything. Although I've never been comfortable with like the novella length, which is Nan's favorite. I've become obsessed with novel writing, and I feel like it's a process like writing the short stories was. I wrote a lot of short stories for many years before I published anything. And I think I just have to write a lot of novels to become comfortable and get good at it.
Yeah.
I mean, I've published a few, but I'd like to be a little more consistent with it.
Yeah. Before we run out of time, I want to ask, what are you guys working on right now? Nancy?
Well, I'm working on something. I just finished something that I read at Worldcon. Actually, I finished it a little while ago. It's one of my only collaborations, a novel collaboration. It's with an actual scientist, Dr. Robert Lanza, who was a pioneer in stem cell research. But the novel is actually not about that. It's about the nature of consciousness and the mind and reality. And we worked on it together. A lot of the ideas that are his, the writing is mine. And it's going to be coming out next January.
Oh, exciting.
Yeah, I'm pleased about it.
Yeah.
Jack?
Jack? Yeah, Jack?
Well, I finished a novel last summer, and my agent's shopping it around. It's another SF thriller, and maybe unfortunately, a good section of the book takes place in Ukraine. So if anybody takes this book, I'm going to have to do some rewriting to bring things into a line with the new reality.
Yeah.
Right now, I'm writing a book about truck drivers who are holding the line between an Armageddon that actually occurred in 1963 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the reality we're all living in right now. And the reason that reality hasn't overtaken us is because of these drivers.
Cool. We have there's a question from one of our listeners or watchers, from Ryan Todd, asking, do either of you write poetry?
I don't.
Nancy?
I don't have the ability to compress and to focus on the multiple meanings of single words that good poetry demands. I'm a sprawler. This is why I like novellas.
I don't either. Back when I was doing all my big heavy lifting reading that I keep referring to, I read a lot of poetry as well. But I tended to slip towards narrative poetry like Robert Penn Warren's work. But I've never felt like I could write it competently.
I'm in awe of people who can write poetry because, again, when it's done well, there's so much compressed layers of meaning in just a few words.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, I've been amazed. Jane Yolen does her poem a day that she'll email you a different poem every day.
That's amazing.
They're short, but it's astounding.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's really good.
Well, that sounds like there's some good stuff coming from you guys. I'm looking forward to it. We are basically out of time. This has been just delightful, as always. Talking to you is always delightful, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time out from the rain in Seattle to visit with us. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you, Mike. I always appreciate it when I can tell that an interviewer has actually read the work. And it makes a difference, and it's always
a plus. Yeah,
it's always good to see you.
Well, reading your guys' stuff is fun. It was more rereading than reading. So thanks a lot. And this is Mike Zipser here live from Fast Forward saying, take care, get vaccinated, wash your hands, damn it. Adios.